Okay, so we're diving into Indian poetry in English today.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And, it's really more than just poems. It's like a window into India's whole journey, like all the cultural shifts and how their identities evolved over time.
Yeah, you gave me a lot of interesting stuff to look at about all that.
Yeah, I tried to give you a good mix of sources, articles, research, even your own notes, and they all kind of dig into the history, the big themes, the different styles. And I guess what we're really trying to do today is like figure out, how all these poets have used English to say what being Indian means to them.
Sounds like a plan.
Hopefully uncover some surprises along the way too,
Yeah,
stuff even you haven't thought about too much. So where do we even start? I mean, it seems like based on what you gave me, the story really begins back in the 1800s, right?
right. Yeah, the 19th century, that's when it all kind of kicked off. And, the British were ruling India then,
Mm-hmm.
and they brought with them English education.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big part of the story, like how this whole tradition even started.
Makes sense. So who are we talking about here? Like, who are these early poets?
Well, one of the pioneers is Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers.
Jerozy, oh yeah, he was born in 1809, right?
That's right.
And one of the articles you gave me mentioned that he was Eurasian, right?
Exactly. Indo-Portuguese descent.
Which, probably gave him a pretty unique perspective.
For sure.
Like this one poem of his, The Fakir of Junghira, from 1828. I was reading it, and it's so clearly influenced by that romantic style, all about emotions and the individual. But then he like brings in all these Indian themes too. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that he's not just like writing pretty words. He's like taking on the big social issues of his time.
Like sati tea, that practice of widows burning themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. I mean, wow, that's heavy stuff.
Right, so he's using poetry to make people think, to critique what's going on around him. And it's crazy that he did all that in such a short life.
He died young, didn't he?
Yeah, tragically young. But he made a huge impact. His legacy lives on.
Totally set the stage for what was to come.
Well, that's exactly.
And then, moving on a bit later in the 19th century, there's Toru Dutt, another amazing poet who died really young too. But she left behind this incredible collection, Ancient Ballads and the Legends of Hindustan.
Published posthumously, right?
Yeah, in 1882. And it's so beautiful. She takes these iconic stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, all these Indian myths and legends, and tells them in English verse with such lyricism. It's just amazing.
It's so powerful. Like she's claiming her own cultural heritage, but expressing it in the language that was, in a way, the language of the colonizer.
Right. Like it's this early fusion of cultures that we were talking about before.
Exactly. And done with such skill and beauty.
Yeah, it's really something. And then we can't forget Sarojini Naidu, the Nightingale of India.
Her work is so captivating.
I was looking at some of her poems from The Golden Threshold, the collection from 1905. And what struck me is how she blends this strong sense of nationalism, which, was really growing at the time, with these incredibly vivid images of India.
Right? Like she's painting these pictures with words of the landscapes, the folklore. It's also evocative.
And, it's more than just pretty descriptions. Her poetry was really tied to that whole nationalist movement. It was helping to shape a new Indian identity.
Absolutely.
So, we've got Desrosiers Dutt Naidu, these early pioneers, and it's clear they were influenced by Victorian styles, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You can see it in their work, but at the same time, they're doing something new.
Right. It's like they're starting to carve out a space for this distinctly Indian English voice.
It's fascinating to see that evolution, from imitation to innovation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that context. They're working within these existing frameworks, but they're also pushing boundaries. They're trying to find ways to express Indian experiences in this language that wasn't originally theirs.
Makes sense.
But then, of course, everything changes in 1947.
Huge shift, right? Independence and partition, like a whole new world opens up.
And for poets, it meant like they had to find a new way to express themselves.
Right, they wanted something more authentic. Something that wasn't so tied to the colonial past.
Like decolonizing their voices.
Exactly.
And that's where we get this renaissance, this incredible period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with all these amazing poets who really reshaped the landscape of Indian English poetry.
Yeah, like Nissim Ezekiel. He's often considered the father of modern Indian English poetry.
For good reason.
Oh, yeah, he brought in this whole new sensibility, this ironic wit and urban realism that was so different from what came before.
His poems feel so grounded in the everyday realities of India.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to be critical, but it's always with this sense of compassion. Like he's not just complaining, he's trying to understand.
The Night of the Scorpion is such a good example of that.
Powerful poem.
You have this rural setting, all these traditional beliefs about the scorpion sting, and then you have the narrator who's kind of looking at it all with this more modern, almost skeptical eye.
It's like he's caught between two worlds.
Totally. And that tension between tradition and modernity is something we see a lot in Indian English poetry.
For sure.
And then there's Enterprise, another one of his famous poems. It's often read as an allegory for post-independence India, all these big hopes and dreams, but then the reality of like bureaucracy and internal conflicts.
It can be frustrating, right, when things don't move as fast as you want them to.
Yeah, and Ezekiel captures that so well, but maybe the most radical thing he did was embrace colloquial Indian English.
That was huge.
Like that line, I am standing for peace and nonviolence. It seems so simple, but it was revolutionary at the time. Like he was saying, it's okay to write poetry in the way Indians actually speak English.
He legitimized a whole new way of using the language.
Totally. And then you have Kamala Das, who took things in a totally different direction with her incredibly personal and confessional poetry.
She was fearless.
I know, right? And her poem, An Introduction from 1965, is like a bomb went off.
So bold.
The way she talks about female desire and identity, I mean, no one was doing that before, at least not so directly.
She broke down so many barriers.
That line, I am every woman who seeks love, it's still so powerful.
It's like an anthem.
She brought this raw honesty to her work. She wasn't afraid to talk about things that were considered taboo, especially for women.
And she does it all with this incredible blend of her own Malayali background and the English language.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it really expanded the possibilities of what Indian English poetry could be.
For sure.
And then there's A.K. Ramanujan, who brought another layer of complexity to the scene.
He was a master of language.
You can tell, right? Like his poems are so intricate, the way he weaves together memory, myth, and all these different linguistic influences. It's amazing.
His collections, the Striders are full of that.
And his translations of Sangam poetry were so important too, bringing these ancient Tamil works to a wider audience.
Right, like opening up these different literary traditions.
And his own poems, like A River, are so insightful. I mean, the way he juxtaposes these ancient traditions with this modern indifference to suffering, it's really a powerful commentary on society.
Makes you think about how we engage with the past and the present, and how those two things connect.
Definitely. And, moving on from there, from the late 20th century onwards, we see this big shift again as globalization starts to really impact Indian English poetry.
Things open up even more, right?
Yeah, we get the rise of diaspora poets who are grappling with all these new themes like migration displacement, that feeling of being caught between worlds.
Like Vijay Seshadri, who won a Pulitzer for 3 sections.
Yeah, he's incredible. And Sujata Bhatt, her work is so powerful too. She really gets at that complex sense of belonging.
And it's not just about the diaspora experience. We also see poets engaging with issues within India itself. Things like urbanization and the environmental crisis.
Exactly. It's like the poetry is reflecting these big changes that are happening in society.
And stylistically, we see more experimentation too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Jeet Tail with these errors are correct. His work is so fragmented, it's almost like a reflection of our modern world. All these broken narratives and anxieties.
That's very postmodern.
And then you have Dashani Doshi, her collection, Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, is so haunting and powerful. The way she addresses gender violence, it's really important work.
And Imtiaz Darker with The Terrorist at My Table, the way she uses these everyday metaphors to talk about political extremism, it's so effective.
Like it makes these huge, complex issues feel very personal and immediate.
Right, you can really connect with it.
And what's also really cool is that we're seeing all this regional diversity coming through too. Poets like Temsala Ayo from Nagaland and Kinfams and Namkari from Meghalaya, they're bringing in the oral traditions and the ecological perspectives of Northeast India.
It's expanding the whole scope of what Indian English poetry can be.
And it shows that this tradition is still evolving, it's constantly incorporating new voices and experiences.
For sure, it's a living, breathing thing.
So, we've looked at all these different poets and historical periods, but what are some of the big ideas that connect it all? What are some of the recurring themes we see throughout Indian English poetry?
Well, cultural hybridity is definitely a big one.
Like that feeling of being in between worlds.
Right. These poets are constantly navigating their relationship with both Indian and Western traditions. And sometimes it's like they don't fully belong to either.
Ramanujan had that great line in Self-Portrait, I resemble everyone but myself.
Yeah, perfect way to put it.
And then closely related to that is this whole idea of postcolonial identity. What does it mean to be Indian after independence?
That's a big question that a lot of these poets grapple with, especially in the decades after 1947.
Like Ezekiel and Doss,
Yeah,
they're questioning nationalist narratives and exploring what it means to be an individual within this new context.
right, like redefining themselves.
And another interesting theme is the reinterpretation of mythology. It's not just about telling old stories, it's about using them to comment on contemporary issues.
Like Vikram Seth with the Golden Gate. He reimagines the Mahabharata in sonnets.
Yeah, that's a clever one. And Ranjit Hoskoto in Central Time, he takes these archetypal figures and deconstructs them to explore modern anxieties.
Really interesting approach.
It's like they're taking these ancient stories and making them relevant to the present.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't forget the engagement with social issues.
Right. These poets are tackling big questions about caste, gender, poverty, violence.
Even though Dalit poetry mainly exists in regional languages, its influence is felt in English too.
Yeah.
Through poets like Meena Kandasamy, who directly challenges those traditional power structures.
And Jayanta Mahapatra's Hunger is such a stark portrayal of poverty and exploitation, it's hard to forget.
These poets aren't afraid to shine a light on difficult realities.
And they do it with such power and skill.
And we've touched on this before, but it's worth emphasizing again how these poets have really transformed the English language itself.
They've made it their own.
It's not just a borrowed tongue anymore. It's been infused with Indian rhythms and expressions.
A whole new way of using language.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from those early pioneers to these incredibly diverse and globally connected voices that we see today.
It's been quite a journey.
And I think what's really come through is this sense of how dynamic Indian identity is, this constant back and forth between tradition and modernity, between local and global influences.
And the poetry reflects that so beautifully. It's like a record of that ongoing conversation.
So as you think about everything we've talked about today, all these different poets and themes, I want you to consider this, given how Indian poets have taken this language that was initially imposed on them during colonialism and transformed it into something so uniquely their own. What does that tell us about the power of language to evolve and adapt, especially when it crosses cultural boundaries?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, like what happens when a language moves from one culture to another? Does it change the language itself, or does it change the people who use it, or maybe both?
I mean, it's definitely a two-way street.
And I think Indian English poetry really highlights that, it's like this amazing example of how language can become a site of resistance and creativity and cultural exchange.
Makes you think about the whole concept of post-colonial identity in a new light.
Exactly. And, I hope this has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives on Indian English poetry.
It certainly has for me.
And, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore.
Oh yeah, this is just the beginning.
So we encourage you to dig deeper into this incredibly rich and rewarding literary landscape.
There's a whole world waiting to be discovered.
Thanks for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.